What would you do if someone demanded your seat on a flight? Would you give in or stand your ground? This is the story of one woman who refused to be pressured and how things took an unexpected turn. Kaisha Monroe sighed in relief as she settled into her window seat on the crowded Airbus A320. She had paid extra for this spot, wanting the peace and quiet that came with it. A good book, noise-canceling headphones, and the simple expectation of being left alone were all she needed for the long flight ahead. Passengers hurried through the aisles, placing their bags in overhead compartments, and flight attendants made their final checks. Just as Kaisha flipped open the first few pages of her book, a deep voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, I need you to move." She looked up to see a middle-aged man towering over her, dressed sharply, his expensive wristwatch gleaming under the cabin lights. His posture oozed entitlement. Beside him stood a little girl, no older than 6, clutching a stuffed rabbit and avoiding Keisha's gaze. "My daughter needs the window seat. She gets anxious during flights," he said, his tone making it clear he expected her to comply. Kaisha hesitated before answering, "I'm sorry, but I paid for the seat." For a brief moment, the man, his name, Richard Aldridge, was pinned to his carry-on, looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened. "She's a child," he repeated slowly, as if Kaisha hadn't understood. "Surely you get that." Kaisha understood plenty. She understood that a man who could afford a Rolex had failed to plan ahead for his daughter's needs. She understood that he assumed she'd give up her seat without question. And she understood that, if she had been anyone else, maybe older, maybe a different race, his approach might have been different. Still, she remained calm. "I understand, but I also paid for the seat. If it was that important, you should have booked accordingly." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. Then, louder, making sure nearby passengers could hear, he said, "This is what's wrong with people today. No basic decency." Murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others curious. Kaisha felt the heat of their stares. Before she could respond, a flight attendant arrived. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Her name tag read Sandra Wallace. Richard jumped in before Kaisha could speak. "Yes, this woman won't give up her seat for my daughter." Sandra raised an eyebrow, waiting for the real issue. Richard sighed dramatically, motioning to his daughter. "She gets anxious on flights. She needs the window. I asked her to switch, but she refused." Sandra turned to Kaisha. "You booked the seat?" Kaisha nodded. "Yes." Sandra looked back at Richard. "Sir, she has the seat assigned to her." Richard scoffed. "I'm asking her to do the right thing. Surely the airline values customer service." Sandra's patience was wearing thin. "Sir, customer service doesn't mean forcing another passenger to move from a seat they paid for." Richard's face reddened. His voice rose. "This isn't about rules, it's about kindness." A grown woman refusing to accommodate a child. The way he said it made Keisha's stomach tighten. She knew his game. He was trying to shame her into submission, making her the villain. But Sandra stood firm. "Sir, if you need a window seat, I can check if any are available. But I won't ask another passenger to move from their assigned seat." Richard turned to Kaisha, eyes narrowing. "You really won't move for a child?" Kaisha met his gaze. "I paid for this seat. I'm staying in it." Richard let out a humorless laugh, looking around at other passengers. "Can you believe this? A full-grown woman refusing to switch with a 6-year-old. Some passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Others watched, waiting to see what would happen. Kaisha felt the pressure. It would be easy to give in, to avoid the hassle. But why was it always her who had to be the bigger person? Sandra stepped closer, a clear show of support. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time to take your assigned seat." Richard's nostrils flared. He muttered something under his breath, but Kaisha caught the last word. Typical. The air in the cabin thickened. Sandra's posture stiffened. She had heard it too. "I'd advise you to be very careful with what you're implying," she said, her voice steely. Before things could escalate further, another voice spoke up. "She paid for her seat," a man from the row behind them said. Sandra turned back to Richard. Sir, I need you to lower your voice. Richard looked around for support, but found none. He gritted his teeth. You have no shame, do you? Kaisha didn't flinch. I paid for this seat, just like everyone else. If it was so important, you should have booked it ahead of time. A woman across the aisle spoke up. She's right. Seats aren't assigned randomly. If you wanted the window, you should have booked it. Richard was losing. His confidence wavered. Then Sandra delivered the final blow. Sir, you can either move to your assigned seat now, or we'll have to speak with the captain. For the first time, Richard looked uncertain, but he wasn't ready to let go just yet. You know what? Keep your seat, he sneered at Kaisha. I wouldn't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you anyway. The words hit hard, but Kaisha stayed calm. Sandra, however, had enough. That's it. Sir, I need you to come with me. Richard blinked. What? You can take your seat, or we can remove you from this flight. Your choice. Passengers watched in silence. Another flight attendant appeared. Is there an issue? He asked. Sandra nodded. We need to escalate the situation. Richard's face burned red. He glanced toward the cockpit, weighing his options. He had lost. With a final glare at Kaisha, he muttered, You're unbelievable. Then, gripping his daughter's hand, he stomped away. Passengers let out small sighs of relief. Some nodded in approval, others whispered among themselves. Sandra turned to Kaisha. I'm sorry about that. Kaisha managed a small nod. Not your fault. If he bothers you again, let me know immediately. As Sandra walked away, a woman across the aisle smiled at Kaisha. You handled that well. Kaisha let out a short breath. I guess. The woman shook her head. No, seriously. A lot of people would have just moved. You didn't. Kaisha nodded. Because in the end, she hadn't moved, and that was enough. Have you ever faced a situation like this? Tell us in the comments. And if you love stories like these, don't forget to subscribe to Unfolded Tales Explained and hit the bell icon for more.